Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute honor, and it is a tremendous amount of fun to be able to do this. It's also, in many respects, a tremendous amount of work in terms of having a format like this, where, in many ways, especially today, we're at the end of the conference, and we're thinking about all the things that were said yesterday. It feels incumbent on us to be able to respond to yesterday as we're presenting today, which is another way of apologizing for the fact that I never write down my talks. And poor Lisa Grove, who asked me for my talk a week ago, I had to say, it's all up in here, and unfortunately it's going to stay there. But there are there's one way in which I try to come at this, and it is by relying on the American philosopher William James, who in Varieties of Religious Experience said, "It always leads to a better understanding of a thing's significance to consider its exaggerations and perversions, its equivalents and substitutes and nearest relatives elsewhere." And that's very much the approach I'm going to try to take here, is to understand the exaggerations and perversions of nonfiction. And in some respects, perhaps the most perverted instance of nonfiction that I'm aware of right now is one that I am responsible for. I have a project with a co-founder, an Iranian-American man named Vala Vakili, called Sirens. And Sirens reports the news and culture. It offers a review of Dave Egger's most recent essay collection, which he wrote, had edited, printed, and then glued shut. A 4-part true crime investigation of a murder that occurred in the salt caverns beneath Detroit that have been squatted by people without enough money to live above ground. A sex columnist who writes about whether it is in fact cheating if a person uses her Vibra while talking on the phone with her boss. Another one involves a live tweeting of the assassination of Alexis Tsipras after he calls a snap election in Greece in late January of 2022, which hints at the underlying significance of this particular website. None of it is true. It is an imaginary news website reporting the news from exactly 7 years in the future. There are salt caverns beneath Detroit, but they have not yet been squatted because above the salt caverns, the apartments are still cheap enough to live in. Dave Eggers has not yet written an essay collection which he glued all the pages shut. That particular sex toy I alluded to, the Vibra, is not yet a device that connects a vibrator to your cell phone via Bluetooth technology, allowing the voice of the interlocutor to define the rhythm and intensity of the device's operation. So why did we do this? When my colleague is asked why we're doing this, he simply says, weapons of mass destruction. That we cannot rely on the news to, in fact, tell the truth. We have many, many hundreds of years of newspapers not telling the truth, whether they're not telling the truth about Iraq, or they're not telling the truth about whether they hacked into the telephones of the royalty, or they're not telling the truth about the involvement of Spain in Cuba, culminating in the Spanish-American War of the late 19th century. We felt that it may very well be the case that you can use fiction to, in fact, tell the news potentially better than journalists can. Now, obviously, that's a tremendous provocation, and I don't exactly believe it, but I believe it enough to try. And we know we'll fail in many ways, but what we're interested in doing is creating a database that catalogs our failures. We haven't built the database yet, but we have a name for it. It's just like a book where you've got the title, but you haven't written the book yet. The database is called Cassandra. And it will track all the ways in which we are wrong so we can preserve them. Because effectively the site would become a retroactive history of the future, like the movie Sliding Doors, where there are forking realities that occur. We will maintain a reality in which Hillary is elected President of the United States in 2016, and one in which she is not. It is, in a certain respect, what is called the long con. There's a wonderful book called The Long Con about the development of con artists in the United States, an activity that now drives a great many films, especially ones written by David Mamet. The short con is simply one act of deceit, but the long con involves building offices, having two different people, the excitable person and the person who says, don't do this, don't do this, you don't want to be a part of it, you don't have the money. And in many respects, nonfiction is an act of playing a long con, but where the final goal is to not steal the money, but to teach the mark about himself. One of the things that we almost, and I think, and Anne basically said it yesterday, we almost got there, was why do we call it nonfiction? And I know that's not the term that's used in every one of the language cultures represented here, but effectively what nonfiction says is it's defining itself by what it is not. Nonfiction says this is the act of not lying. And as any of you who have ever dealt with a child who has broken a wine glass and said, "It wasn't me," you ask yourself when somebody says what they are not, what is it that they're really hiding? And so there's a kind of a bubbling anxiety that I think goes on in the sort of subterranean depths of nonfiction, where you're continually worried about, am I lying? And a way I would like to try to explore that a little bit more is by looking at, again, another set of exaggerations and perversions. A set that Neil described a little bit yesterday, into which I'd like to do a slightly deeper dive. A very good friend of mine is writing a book that will publish in the US by Woolf sometime in 2017. This is in fact true. This is not a book that we're just inventing for the purposes of reviewing it in Sirens. It will in fact exist. It's called Unoriginal Sin: How to Spot Hoaxes, Plagiarists, Phonies, Frauds, and Fabulists. And I think an interesting way to look at nonfiction is to look at what happens when it gets fucked up really badly. And that's what my friend does. The interesting thing that he mentions in the very introduction is that he personally is usually only 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from the people who are the famous celebrity frauds. And I suspect that may be true, at least of a number of people here in this room. One of the most famous journalistic frauds in the United States is actually my brother-in-law, a guy named Stephen Glass, who was made maybe slightly famous by the fact that there was a movie made about him called Shattered Glass. You can see that there's a theme developing.
Last night.
He was played by Hayden Christensen. Peter Skarsgård was the guy who was convinced he was going to unearth the scandal. Chloe Sevigny was his boss's girlfriend. It had a certain level of notoriety. He was a journalist for the New Republic magazine in the early 1990s and became their most successful, celebrated, popular, and widely discussed writer, publishing, I think, as many as 5 cover stories over the course of his 2 years writing for the magazine, all of which were fabricated. Fabricated in the manner of the long con, where he even at one point tried to build a fake website for the fake company that he was discussing in his fake article about imaginary computer programmers at a fake conference. The interesting thing about that, the extent of that fakery, is that while, yes, it was an incredibly elaborate effort, every one of these things was ultimately, with hindsight, very transparent. The website was terrible. The business cards he faked up had a single voice mailbox that no one ever answered. There was no evidence that this conference happened anywhere other than in his imagination. Yet it all, as I will discuss a little bit later, why it all eluded the fact checkers. Another particular story of his involved a taxi driver, a African taxi driver, I believe Ethiopian, and it was a story about effectively the perceived fork between how first-generation African immigrants were working extremely hard in America, yet African Americans were quote-unquote lazy. They were, in the parlance of Ronald Reagan, welfare mothers, just sucking money out of the welfare system and doing nothing to better themselves. As it so happens, this happened to be a particular conceit that had been suggested to him by the editor-in-chief of the magazine, a guy named Martin Peretz, who's a history professor at Harvard, and owned this magazine for a number of years. And Peretz had, over a period of time, become closely associated with a kind of, I hesitate to use the term neoliberal because it doesn't quite capture it, but he was associated with the phase of the reform, scare quotes, of the Democratic Party in the United States, somewhat similar to what went on with the Labour Party in the UK, where it was trying to separate itself from its affiliation with unions and the welfare state and be seen to become a much more business-friendly party. And this particular story hints at what was clearly the larger problem with these stories, is that the reason he was so successful is people wanted them to be true. And it suggests something that is really critical to understand about the hoax, which is that it tells as much about us as it tells about the hoaxer, because it relies on what we believe to be true, or almost want to be true, or assume to be true about the world. So he feeds on our own desire for a story, something that cognitive psychologists like to call confirmation bias. One of the reasons my friend is particularly, and he's a poet predominantly, this is his second book of nonfiction. One of the reasons he is interested in this particular topic, though, is because one of the things that often happens around frauds, and it happened, for example, with the Howard Hughes biography that Neil mentioned yesterday, which is being reissued as a novel, is that, and it happened with James Fry, where it sort of suggested that these things are novels. So often what happens, it happens also with an Australian book, the name of which, by a woman named Marlo Morgan, a book called Mutant Message, which is a white lady who manages to get adopted by an Aboriginal tribe in Australia, and reports about their purity and their telepathic abilities to communicate, enacting all the fantasies of the West about how these primitive tribes are possessed of this sort of tremendous wisdom, a phenomenon you will see in movies featuring the old African-American lady dispensing words of wisdom in a very beautiful voice, or in the case of a man, typically James Earl Jones, being the stable, wise person, something that you also see in anything around Native American representation in films and literature too. What interests him and angers him is turning it into a novel any less corrupt, any less, does it make it in any way truer? And what he's interested in is arguing that it doesn't. That simply saying, okay, well, I guess I made some of the stuff up, but it's basically true, is the most pernicious lie of all, because what it maintains is all those cultural stereotypes, all those lies that we tell ourselves about the world, and that it is the duty not just of the nonfiction writer, but also of the poet and the fiction writer to be questioning those received truths rather than simply glibly surfing along them. A nice example, again, Neil mentioned it yesterday, a woman who is in fact, a young woman who is in fact named Margaret B. Seltzer, but pretended to be part Native American, part African American, living in South Central Los Angeles. And it is again another example of where it would have been so easy to know that this was completely made up. Her dialogue is a poem. And I quote a little bit of it. She's allegedly talking to a drug dealer at the side of the street, and she says they were discussing whether or not she would be a kind of a drug mule for him, and she wants to be, and so she said, he thought about it for a minute, then laughed. Sure enough, you right. I'm gonna take a chance on you. You meet me here tomorrow morning before school, spelled S-K-O-O-L. You go to school, S-K-O-O-L, right? And as my friend continues, the gap between the narrator's standard English voice and her use of slang is not only strained, neither her story nor her vernacular is believable, resorting to cliches. Hers is the distortion of black English, taken not from life, but from plantation novels and gangsta cinema. Rather than a living language, these are the broad strokes of speech misheard. Language as a bunch of missteps learned nowhere near school, when in truth the vernacular is actually a varied, vivid commentary on language itself. Hence the old joke. You know the difference between a dialect and a language? An army. Speaking of armies, one of the things that also becomes clear as we look at the exaggerations and perversions of nonfiction, and indeed fiction, is a great hoax played by Virginia Woolf and some of her friends about 6 months before she made the famous comment about when modernism began, which is in late 2010, she says modernism begins. But 6 months before that, she and her friends applied beards, in her case, applied blackface and a turban, and show up pretending to be a visiting delegation from the government of Abyssinia, and board the HMS Dreadnought, which was the great battleship of the British Navy in the lead up to World War I. And they are taken on board the ship. One of the officers on board the ship is in fact Virginia Woolf's own cousin. Yet he fails to recognize Virginia Woolf in a crappy beard and shoe polish. It takes a week for the hoax to be discovered. Why? Because it is very easy to believe what you want to believe about Abyssinia when you've never been there. How can we deal with this particular problem? You know, one of the challenges around all this is what I'm effectively saying is that everything is fucked. That if the problem is not just how do we deal with the truth content of nonfiction, but how do we deal with the truth content of any form of writing whatsoever, how can we proceed? And I'd like to suggest that we could begin by looking at a very, very different book, a book called The Black Swan by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. And the book is mostly focused on debunking economics, and especially bond traders and stock traders, by basically saying that the humans have a very hard time understanding catastrophic risk. We're good at figuring out the risk of missing your train in the morning, or maybe the risk of marrying the wrong person, or the risk of dropping your iPad, or
smashing glass.
But what we are not good at figuring out is the risk of when earthquakes will happen, or the risks of when an asteroid will hit our planet, or the risks of when the stock market will crash. But one of our cognitive psychological attributes of our species that he zeroes in on as being partially responsible for this is something he calls the narrative fallacy. Consider the following statement he offers from E.M. Forster, who is attempting to describe what narrative is. The king died and the queen died. So those are two facts. Compare that to the king died and then the queen died of grief. It is much easier to remember the second sentence because it takes two facts and turns them into a single narrative idea. And one of the things we have to struggle with as we sort of became the kind of planet-dominating species that we've become is we have to deal with too much information. We have to process large amounts of information, and as you can see, just looking in this room, we've had to process a gymnasium full of books up until 30 years ago. Now we have to process vast terabytes of data on the internet. And so how do we do that? And we do that through narrative, because narrative helps simplify information. It takes, if you were to do a book that consisted of random strings of words for 50,000 words, it would be absolutely impossible to remember. If on the other hand, you had a book that consisted of nothing but the sentence that said, Richard Nash broke his glass in his dessert last night 5,000 times, you would remember it very easily. Narrative is somewhere in between. Narrative is how our brains condense information, and not just condense it, but allow it to be remembered and allow it to be retold, so you can retransmit the information. In Anand's example of his song yesterday, poetry is even more powerful in doing that, and song, because of the rhythm. So rhythm also provides an ability to kind of condense and remember information. And effectively, what happens though is when you are condensing and simplifying information is you leave stuff out. Did the queen die of grief? Was the queen murdered? Was the king murdered by the queen's lover and then had a fight with the queen and then killed the queen? These are all pieces of information that get left out because we are very comfortable with the idea that the king died and the queen died of grief. And so what Taleb asks us to do, in a certain sense, is something very simple, but also very difficult. But also, I think, something that we in book culture, as writers, as editors, as literary journalists, have the ability and opportunity to do, which is to be skeptical, which is to start to not just look for a good story, but to think about when a story might be too good. As much as it is so often our job to find the good story, the one that will sell, the one that has the right ending, the one that has a frame that will work, that simultaneously it's our responsibility to look for where it is too good. And to hint at how difficult this is within our own particular lives, I'm reminded of the problem of proofreading. And this is something we do understand, that proofreading is not just something that you do once, where it's the editor of who's the developmental editor, or the acquisitions editor, or the commissioning editor that does it. You pay somebody else who is a professional proofreader to do it. Why? Because there is a narrative fallacy that goes on in our brains, and you've probably seen this, the number of times the internet has produced a different meme where you look at a sentence and you see what's the problem with this sentence, and then you realize that the way the line break is, the word "the" is repeated twice. Because we are very good at looking for patterns. Like narrative, as a subset of patterns, patterns are how we are able to condense information. But we are too good at finding patterns. We find causality where causality doesn't exist. We complete incomplete sentences. We mentally delete sentences that have an error in them. And so proofreaders will use little tricks like covering over the words in the rest of the sentence so that they don't know what's coming next, so that their brain isn't looking for the word that should come next. And I would argue that that is something that we could then deploy in what we do. If there was one thing that kind of came out as another kind of undercurrent of yesterday, it was about failure and learning to be able to handle failure in productive kinds of ways. To not just repeat the same error again and again, but to learn from it, to fail again, to fail better. Thank you.